I just want to thank everyone for being here today. It's a genuine pleasure and privilege to join all of you for this very important conversation and seminar on one of the most consequential challenges in the Western Hemisphere, which is the reconstruction of Venezuelan democracy. Rebuilding democracy in Venezuela is part of a four-part webinar series that CDDRL and the Democracy Action Lab are hosting to examine Venezuela's current juncture and the prospects for a transition to democracy through the lens of the political, economic, security, and justice-related challenges that will ultimately determine its success. This series precisely will try to offer practical insights and realistic analysis of what would be required for a democratic opening to really happen in Venezuela, drawing on comparative experiences from other post-authoritarian transitions. Venezuela, as you all know, stands at a critical juncture following Nicolás Maduro's removal on January 2026. The question facing Venezuelan democratic forces and international partners is no longer if a transition could happen, but how it could realistically unfold and what risks may undermine it. The discussion today will focus precisely on those institutional, political, strategic constraints shaping a potential democratic opening today. What are the priorities, or what should be the priorities of democratic forces in these early stages of transition, if we can call it so? And what lessons can be drawn from comparative experiences, like particularly in Eastern Europe and other post-authoritarian contexts. Our approach, I want to be clear on this, when we approach the question of Venezuela's democratic future, is normatively grounded. Democracy is desirable, is valuable, and Venezuelan society possesses the fundamental conditions conducive to a prosperous, inclusive, and functional democratic order. Panelists will assess some of these questions and offer practical pathways for analysis on how pathways could look like, highlighting both opportunities, challenges, risks, and blind spots that are, I think, maybe can be embedded into the whole transitional strategies. Today, we have the privilege of having José Ramón Morales Arilla, who is a research professor at Tecnológico de Monterrey's Graduate School of Government and Public Transformation, who's going to focus precisely on the challenges of the Venezuelan transition. We're also going to have Professor Catherine Stoner, who is the Mosbacher Director of CDDRL and the Sartre Family Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies here at Stanford University. And we're also going to be joined by Larry Diamond, who is the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and also the William Clayton Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also known as the Dean of Democracy. Let me thank Catherine for hosting this event, Alberto Diaz-Calleros and Beatriz Magaloni, co-directors of the Democracy Action Lab, and all of our wonderful team at CDDRL, Stacy, Nora, and Jane for making this happen. Each speaker will have like about 10 minutes, and then we'll open a Q&A. You have the Q&A option in your Zoom. Just pose your questions there as they emerge. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to José Ramón to open our discussion. Thanks a lot. The floor is yours, José Ramón.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much, Hector, and everyone for the invitation. It's an honor. I'm going to share just 5 slides to guide the conversation. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the challenges of a Venezuelan transition and what the chances are for that to happen as a consequence of the January 3rd attack and extraction of Nicolás Maduro. And I think the key message, if you have to step out right now, the key message of the statements is that because the autocratic order could quickly reconstitute, front-loading elements or key concessions that make the direction of the current process irrevocably or irreversibly democratic is essential. The front-loading of those concessions is essential. And the way I'm going to structure the talk is that I'm going to first discuss like these 2 near certainties or kind of working assumptions that I used to think about the Venezuelan environment right now. Then I'm going to discuss the key uncertainties about the scenario, and specifically those will focus on what does Trump want, or what did he want with the extraction of Maduro, and how does he assess the capabilities of sustaining pressure on Venezuela in time? And then the final point will be like the four levers that I believe Maria Corina Machado has to try to push the process in a direction, in a democratic direction, recognizing that agency is limited, and the key actor in constraining the worst impulses of Chavismo is Trump and the military threat of further kinetic action. So in terms of near certainties, my two key working assumptions about the current environment in Venezuela is that one, the regime remnants do not want to democratize, right? Like Delcy Rodriguez is not a hero of retreat. He's not trying to play the role of Gorbachev. She's not trying to play the role of Adolfo Suarez. She's not trying to play the role of, the clerk. The goal is not to divest from power. The goal is to adapt to a changing set of restrictions. It's not that there's a change in preferences in the leadership of the regime, right? Like it's a change in the restrictions, and you're adapting to the changing restrictions. And importantly, in that environment, they are buying time, which is something that they've been, quite adept at doing for the longest time, the Chavista regime, Maduro himself. And why do they want to buy time? Well, that takes us to our second, like kind of working assumption, that the only thing preventing Chavismo to pursue their worst impulses is the military deterrent, is the fact that the military threat that was put on the table before Maduro was taken out revealed to be credible at the moment. Why are they releasing political prisoners? Why are they allowing for some concessions? It's because they're under threat of further kinetic action. And importantly, how these two working assumptions blend themselves is in this idea of buying time. So the credibility of a military threat decays with time. Today, we saw the news that they're deciding to move the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier from the coast of Venezuela to the Middle East. That means that already the military deterrence element is starting to fade a little bit. They're starting to decouple the elements of economic pressure, like the sanctions on the oil sector and all of that as of today. So this starts to reveal that, not 2 months have gone by, and the threat that was on the table is starting to decay. And importantly, this can decay further if there are events in the world that make the attention of the US administration to shift from Venezuela to other environments, if there's democratic constraints in terms of political backlash, if elections lead to diminished agency in the kind of like use at will of military capabilities. So all these things are happening already, and big milestones in those processes are visible in the scope of within the year, right? Like the midterms in the US are in November. The most likely than not scenario is that Republicans lose the House. If they lose the House, if after losing the House, now an attack could trigger an impeachment. Does Trump want to get into that whole impeachment situation for something in the context of Venezuela? Well, maybe not, and then that means that the threat starts to become not credible again, as it was evaluated before Maduro was taken out. So in that environment, I would expect to see Chavismo returning to their worst impulses and reigniting repression and reigniting economic controls, etc. So the implication of these two working principles, which I'm happy to debate, but I think I believe they are near certainties. The implication is that the window to make the process that the country started in on January 3rd, to make that process become a democratic transition, the opportunity for that is a narrow window, a narrow democratic window of opportunity. So now the leverage is relatively high, but it's starting to fade. If we wait too much, and by the time that the leverage is sufficiently low, they have not divested from the absolute power that they have strictly within Venezuela factors, then we're gonna go back to where we were on January 2nd. Okay? So, so in that environment, so now we come to talk about uncertainties, and the key uncertainty I believe in this environment is what motivated Trump to pursue the extraction of Nicolás Maduro, right? And I think that, there's three possible Trumps, right? Like we don't know which one we're dealing with, or maybe we're dealing with a combination of these Trumps, but, for the purpose of having a taxonomy to guide the conversation, I believe that there's these three Trumps. One is like a neocon Trump that wants a stable partner that is democratic in the region, right? Like Venezuela had become a source of instability in the region, sending 8 million migrants to neighboring countries, receiving, the Wagner Group, Cuban support in the military and in security services, with presence of Hezbollah and other groups, irregular groups from the Middle East. So we don't want that. We want a stable partner that is strong, that is democratic, that is stable. And then if that's the case, well, maybe there's a way to rationalize the decision to support Delcy in a kind of like transitional sense, right? Like, okay, we don't want to debasify the country. We want to prevent the strategies that we don't want to follow the strategies that were pursued in the past. But the check is on the mail, right? Like we are going to continue forcing the democratic direction of this because that's how we get to develop a democratic and stable partner in the region. That's one potential Trump. The other potential Trump is, Trump wants oil extraction or for the world to see that there's future oil extraction that's going to happen from Venezuela because that's going to put downward pressure on energy prices today, which is like a very politically salient topic in the US right now. So in that environment, what he wants is stability in the country. But I think that the opposition can present Trump the view that I think has been espoused by the biggest oil companies so far. That is that, democracy, you might not care about democracy, but democracy is instrumental for the construction of the rule of law that is required in order to enable the possibility of the long-term investments that Trump is envisioning for the Venezuelan oil sector. So then democracy might not be the goal of the process, but it might be instrumental. It might be a means to enabling the tens of billions of dollars that are expected to be invested in the Venezuelan oil sector, or that Trump aims at that to happen. And then I think that there's like the darkest version of these possibilities is probably like the populist Trump just wanted the spectacle and control. So the spectacle, the attack itself was the goal. It was the most plausible demonstration of unconstrained power that he could pursue just because Maduro was so illegitimate. So then it's like he's going to get the least backlash by doing something potentially outrageous in the eyes of third parties. But the attack itself was the goal to convey that, to internal and external audiences that I'm unrestrained by any sense of norms, of behavior, and it's just power. No? And if that's the case, I think that that's the more worrisome scenario, because then what the goal for Trump right now is a compliant and functional lackey in Venezuela. And if Delcy is going to be that lackey, you need Delcy to have autocratic control within Venezuela. So in that environment, democracy is not only a nuisance. Democracy is like counterproductive for the purpose of enabling your lackey so that you keep controlling the events. Right? Now, I think that there's another dimension in this topic of, it's about time, and Delcy is buying time. There's a question of how does Trump evaluate the question of time and his capabilities at credibly conveying the military threat that is now disciplining Chavismo away from their worst impulses. So does he expect to be able to sustain deterrence once, the Democrats take over the House? Or does he expect to still be around after 2028, which is a question. Does he believe successors will keep the threat credible, right? Like, does he believe that if he's not around, then Rubio will be around and he'll keep the pressure? Or, he believes that, Democrats that come afterwards, or if they win, or, JD Vance that has a more like isolationist perspective, they'll keep the pressure. So how does he evaluate that, this idea of how much time does he have before concessions that guarantee the process to take an irrevocably or irreversibly democratic direction happen? No? That's another uncertainty, because that tells you like how much of a hurry does he believe there is in terms of pushing for those democratic concessions. And then, in that environment of uncertainty, now the question is, what can Maria Corina do? If you don't know which version of Trump or what combination of the different versions of Trump she's dealing with. And I think that then Maria Corina needs to find ways to act that make democracy the most attractive choice for all Trumps without irreversibly alienating any of them, right? So I think that there are four levers, conceding that the agency is limited and that you need the military threat in order to have some room to play in the Venezuelan environment. In the context of that limited agency, what can you do? And I think that there are like four levers that she has. One is to have a direct relationship with Trump, and I think that that's the way in which you can rationalize what happened with the Nobel Prize, right? Like, and the granting of the medal of the Nobel Prize to Trump and all of that is like, it feels like a bit flattering him in order to gain access to have a direct relationship with him, and in that environment, then starting to make the case of, if we both want to develop the Venezuelan economy, we want to develop the Venezuelan oil sector, but this is a requirement then to achieve that, no? So being able to make your case directly, I think is one of the things that she's trying to do, and I think that that's one of the levers that she has. I think the second one that I also believe we have seen her develop is the idea of widening the coalition of support outside of Venezuela for a democratic direction to the process. So not only in the context of the European Union and regional democracies, but importantly, trying to develop bipartisan support to, regardless of what different parties think about the attack, now that the attack happened, what should happen afterwards? And I think that in that environment, she's been able to, sit down with the people that were the senators that were pushing for constraints on Trump's capability of acting militarily against Venezuela, right? Like she met with Chris Murphy, she met with Tim Kaine, and they were all like, okay, whatever happened, but right now the purpose is a democratic process and bipartisan in a bipartisan way in both chambers and beyond South Florida. That's the point, the kind of policy view of the leadership. So I think that that's smart, because eventually you want to raise the cost of accommodation if accommodation protracts. On the one hand, right? Like, we know that the raising the cost of accommodation with Maduro in terms of like South Florida congressmen threatening not to support the big beautiful bill was one of the things that put the topic on the table in the summer. That's kind of the accounts of how the process got started earlier last year. So continuing to do that in a bipartisan way, I think it's going to be it is a smart strategy. I think that the part where things become a bit more complicated is in developing your own specific way to influence the situation. And the way to do that is in Venezuela, in the territory, right? So then you need to start organizing civil society. We've seen now students start to mobilize, like the families of political prisoners start to mobilize. There's like the resuscitation of the Venezuelan civil society in opposition to the regime. She needs to stimulate that and to magnify that, so that the promise that Delcy gave to Trump, which is like, I'll grant you governability of the process, she cannot provide without you on the table, right? So I think that the most important thing that she could do is just to return to Venezuela. And I think that returning to Venezuela would throw a wrench directly at the accommodation agreement between Trump and Delcy, because if Delcy moves against you and puts you in jail, now it is extremely expensive for Trump to continue to support Delcy. But if Delcy doesn't do it, now you're in Venezuela and now you're organizing civil society, and that's the process in which things start to become irreversibly democratic, right? So I think that that's the problem there is that by doing that, you might be alienating a version of Trump that really doesn't want you to do that, right? Like just let me cook for a minute, right? But then the question is that if you don't believe that he's Trump version number one, but he might be Trump version number three, then you have to make a choice under uncertainty. Because if he's Trump version number three and you believe that Trump version number three, this is what you need to do if you want to push for democracy, right? Like you need to develop specific weight and you need to mobilize the civil society within the country. And then the fourth part, I think that I've been writing a couple of pieces on this topic. When Trump said on January 3rd that Maria Corina didn't have the respect or the support in Venezuela, that was extremely shocking to hear as a Venezuelan, knowing all the support that she has and all of that. But at the same time, you could try to read it from the perspective that he's not talking about the people, he's talking about the necessary elites. He's talking about the military, he's talking about the economic elites, he's talking about the bureaucracy, he's talking about the establishment, kind of that you would need, any government would need in order to be able to govern on the day after of a transition. So I think that there's this view within these elites that she's extremely maximalist, that she's gonna come with the penal code and a machete, and everybody goes to jail because they did everything. And I think that she has the agency to convey credibly that that's not what she wants for the country. Like the thing I'm envisioning is like before going to Venezuela, you make a pit stop in Norway and you show up not only with the Nobel Committee that grants you credibility and that part of your support, but also with the Norwegian government that has been in the Colombian Peace Prize, in which Chavismo was one of the guarantors for FARC and was the mediator of all the negotiation processes between Chavismo and the opposition, in which Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy Rodriguez's brother, was the chief negotiator on the Chavista side. So he's a credible mediator. So I think that by doing that and then showing up with them and saying, what I'm going to return to Venezuela right now, we're going to fight this out, but what we want is to start a credible, technically grounded with international legitimacy process of transitional justice in which we go to truth and reconciliation, and the only thing that is not amnestiable is crimes against humanity. That would immediately tell the vast majority of people in the military, the vast majority of people in the bureaucracy, the vast majority of economic elite, you know, the vast majority of them did not engage in crimes against humanity. So that would give a lot of certainty for their role in a future Venezuela post-transition, and that could, on the one hand, start to buy the acquiescence from elites, from necessary elites, but at the same time credibly convey to Trump that you're not the maximalist that some of these elites are trying to make you to be. Right? But then, so yeah, so that's kind of like where I'm at. I think that the point, just to reiterate, is that the democratic window of opportunity is very narrow. Delcy Rodriguez is buying time. That time is limited because the only thing that they need is the threat of a military action to become not credible again. And if you want to lock in a democratic transition, you need the key concessions to happen before that threat fades. And that's freedom of all political prisoners, that's the return of political exilees, and importantly, that's the decoupling of the repression apparatus. So that if they wanted to repress everyone, they couldn't. If that's not something that is achieved before the military threat fades, then I sadly believe that what's going to happen is that we'll see the reconstitution of the autocratic order sooner rather than later. And that's what hopefully we get to prevent. So thank you so much again for the invitation and looking forward to the discussion.
Jose Ramon, great reflections to kickstart this conversation. And now we're going to give the floor to the Dean of Democracy, to our own Larry Diamond. And let me allow to apologize for the technical issues that prevented you from joining earlier, dear Larry. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Well, uh, every time I read Jose Ramon, I just think, well, this is brilliant. I don't think there's anyone who's been writing about Venezuela who has brought together, deeper general analytic insight from what we've learned about democratic transitions and the behavior of authoritarian elites with, more convincing or at least plausible to me analysis of the realities of the specific actors and what's happening on the ground. So now that we're here together on the Zoom, Jose Ramon, I can say that to you personally, and hope you will continue to write for the Journal of Democracy and other venues. So let me just build on what you said. Most of it makes a lot of sense to me. I'd say one caveat I would like to insert here is that I think if you were thinking that Donald Trump is thinking beyond 2028, that's not at all convincing to me. I have never believed this man cared about democracy in Venezuela. I think he has baser motives that have to do with oil and hemispheric domination. And, this is a problem because if if he doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela and he's just trying to find a superficially satisficing solution that will not lead him to be condemned for embracing authoritarianism, but will just kick the ball down the road in terms of a governable option, namely Delcy Rodriguez or someone like her, then the most plausible prospect in the absence of an extremely adroit strategy by the Democratic opposition and much more engagement by other international actors in some of the ways you were describing, the most plausible prospect for Venezuela is just, a slightly defanged and liberalized autocracy. And I have heard Venezuelans say, well, it's better than the later years of Hugo Chavez and the whole miserable decade plus of Nicolás Maduro. Um, and if we could get greater respect for our human rights and, some degree of normalization, even if it didn't lead to democracy, it would be better than what we had. But I don't think the quest for democracy should be abandoned. And I don't think the trust that, a soft autocracy, a dicta blanda is what O'Donnell and Schmitter called it, would be sustainable or would not disintegrate again into a dictadura, a hard autocracy. One thing I didn't hear you address that concerns me now at this moment, and I'm sorry that the constellation of problems brought me here a bit late, is that is the divisions within the regime. O'Donnell and Schmitter, say, well, there's no democratic transition that doesn't begin with a division within the regime. Uh, that I think is not always exactly true, but we know that plays a role. But it can potentially play a role in different directions, particularly if the hardliners have more power than the softliners and can ultimately sabotage them, in particular if they control the force. And we know in the case of Cabello and the defense minister that, where I think we know, you can comment on this, it's really the hardliners that control both the formal force in the military and the informal force of the colectivos and so on. And, so it's the threat, yes, of American military intervention further that might keep them in line and keep things on a pathway toward liberalization and eventually, potentially, democratization through another election. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So I worry in the very near term about potential sabotage from hardliners. I worry about the situation in which we bet heavily on civil society mobilization in the space of liberalized autocracy, in the aftermath of release of political prisoners, and then have another crackdown and more people rearrested and more people even killed in the middle of the night, and then Delcy Rodriguez coming to Trump and Grinnell and whoever else she's dealing with, Rubio and so on, and saying, the CIA, Ratliff, what can I do? I don't control the armed forces. I don't control the colectivos. And so you said um, you worried about raising the cost of accommodation. I am very worried about how we raise the cost of repression. It is the thing that most occupies me. So we know from Dahl and everything since Robert Dahl that political actors in these kinds of situations are constantly doing a calculus where they're balancing off the cost of repression versus the cost of tolerance. And we are lowering the cost of tolerance, or I should say we're taking some steps to lower the cost of tolerance in their calculation. But the most important steps to lower the cost of toleration are some of the things you talked about in terms of Maria Corina Machado and the Democratic opposition on the ground, engaging various actors and saying, look, we're not after vengeance here. We're ready to do a South African style deal or other styles of deals. We're ready to consider, some multi-level system of amnesty. Some few people are going to probably have to go abroad into exile as the only way of offering it. There's no place for them in the future if they are guilty of crimes against humanity. But most of the others, they can find a place in the new system under some kind of truth and reconciliation process. Uh, we haven't talked about the assets that they have illegally accumulated at massive levels and what happens to those. I think realistically, to get the people who are really controlling the power and have the worst blood on their hands to go into exile, there's got to be some implicit deal from the international community that they can enjoy their filthy wealth if they just leave. That's a very difficult and troubling thing to consider, but there'd probably be an element here of the US and maybe Europe making some kind of agreement not to prosecute these people. Um, but then I want to say, because I've been thinking about this in the Iranian context as well as the Venezuelan context, and they are just dramatically different contexts. But there's a way in which I think they are similar, and that is that I think there's a limit to what force can achieve to bring about regime change. I want to make it clear. I know many people will disagree with me. I do not support what the United States did to, militarily intervene in and capture President Maduro. I didn't support the U.S. invasion of Iraq either, but I went there for 3 months to work in the Coalition Provisional Authority for the same reason that Chris Murphy and Tim Kaine, very good senators, are sincerely concerned to see how democracy can emerge now. It happened. We have the situation we have now. How can we try and get democracy out of it? So I guess the final point I want to make now, or maybe the penultimate point, is we need levers to say to the hardest liners and really all actors in the authoritarian context in Venezuela. So the people we think are softliners, like Delcy Rodriguez and her brother, the people we know are hardliners, like Cabello and the defense minister Vladimir Padrino. Um, you know, here's what we have on you, and here's what we're doing. We are now imposing these targeted sanctions on you, and we can ramp things up. And friends, we can make your lives really miserable. Um, and so, if you don't cooperate with a democratic transition, you're going to pay a very heavy personal price, and so are your kids in their ability to travel and move money around the country and around the world and so on. I agonize a lot about how you pursue and implement these targeted sanctions, and I do this without, direct experience of having been able to make this work inside the U.S. government. And I know that you've got to have very good intelligence to do this. And I really wonder, how much we've really invested in trying to accumulate that intelligence. But I will just say that every day these people are waking up and saying, what's the balance between the cost of tolerance and the cost of repression? And if we don't squeeze hard in the minds of the authoritarian actors, that calculation of the costs and risks they're running for clinging to repression and resistance and sabotage of the democratic transition, I don't think we're going to get there without, massive means of force that I certainly would not favor, and I don't think the American public would favor. I do want to note on the regional side, the massive failure of the inter-American community after the election in July of 2024. And really, in my mind, the failure of the Biden administration as well. Nobody took this seriously and really mobilized the kind of pressure that should have been mobilized to respect the results of the election. However, there's probably going to be a change of government in Colombia this year. And in early August, a new president of Colombia is going to be inaugurated, and it's probably going to be someone who's much more inclined to exert pressure on the Venezuelan regime than President Petro has been. And at the end of this year, there'll be a presidential election in Brazil. My guess is Lula will be reelected, but maybe the right will come back to power. And that could generate an opportunity for some fresh calculation. Maybe Lula in his final term will be less afraid of the left wing of his own coalition than he is right now. I just don't know. But, we have a new president of Chile who is, I think, much more inclined to want to lean on this. So I don't want to give up on the inter-American community. I think it's extremely important. And with that, I'll pass it over to Catherine.
Dear Catherine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I have a few slides which may be helpful to address some of the questions, or I could just talk. But I will just say at the outset, everybody should remember that I am not an expert on Venezuela or Latin America. I study Russia and Eastern Europe, so former communist space. But I think there are some lessons there that we can attach to some of the more theoretical things we've been talking about. And if I am able to find my, yes, here we go. First of all, what is a democratic transition include? Well, one question to ask is transition from what to what, right? Ideally here in autocracy to democracy, but statistically speaking, unfortunately, we tend to see across the world the transition, probably 70% of the time, is from autocracy to a different form of autocracy. And so, as Jose was saying at the beginning, that's if we don't act quickly in Venezuela, that unfortunately is the most likely outcome. So if the transition is going to be to democracy, there's a question about when does it start and when does it end? Well, arguably it has started, but we won't know that probably until it's done. But it's essentially an acceptance of new rules and new processes and uncertainty by everyone. So that is the opposition or new leaders and the old leaders. And so a lot of what we have talked about so far, Larry and Jose, is really talking about that. I won't talk about consolidation right now, but in modern cases, political democracy comes out as a stalemate between the best of otherwise bad alternatives for the autocrats in power. So either you're going to be dragged through the streets or dragged out of a tunnel, as was Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, or hung, in the way that Ceausescu in Romania was. That's or you're, going to be ousted and exiled with nothing, essentially. That's usually the worst alternative for an autocrat. And so the question is, how do we get there, right? And one of the questions Hector asked us to consider is, how do transitions begin when the incumbents have little incentives to negotiate? And while the answer is obviously find ways to create those incentives, we have to get them to surrender to the rules and to the chance that in a political democracy, it's, as I said, institutionalized uncertainty, right? And that's Adam Jaworski. The outcome is unknown, but you think you have a chance of getting into power through contested elections. So this I've adapted from our colleague Frank Fukuyama, and this is just dimensions of development that might be relevant to Venezuela. So I put in brackets this economic growth thing, because you can't wait for that. It could take several hundred years. And actually, you have some of this already. I think where we are is more in this. Oh, you probably can't see my arrow, right? Hang on, I'll use my pencil. We're probably in this area. That's what we're dealing with in Venezuela in the next few years. I think Jose mentioned, one of the powers of the opposition, obviously, and they will know this far better than I would, is that they do have organized political parties. They do have the ability to mobilize masses of people, and that is really their leverage against the regime. The regime has been able to neutralize that by using force. And as Larry said, you want to increase the cost to them of using force. So you can get to this. I turned off my little arrow again. So you can get to accountability and have free and fair elections, a real working parliament, and an executive that is either a check on parliament, or parliament is a check as well on the executive, that has rule of law, an independent judiciary, laws that constrain societal actors so we don't kill one another, but also political actors from acting against societal actors, and in particular the state, right? So that's really the security question. And then thirdly, as was mentioned, the professionalization of a bureaucracy that is, at least stays in power and is independent of elected politicians. This is where American democracy is having a lot of trouble right now with rule of law in the state. But I think Venezuela has a few great things going for it currently. That is this idea that democratization and the transition really will come from an idea, and the legitimacy of an alternative, which is the election of an alternative that has already happened and that was stolen, and that most people in Venezuela, it seems to me, agree with, right? That it was stolen, and the illegitimacy of the current regime. So whether or not Maria Corina goes back immediately to help mobilize society. That is not for me to say, but getting good information on the ground to find out what would happen. I'm guessing that she and her people have already done that, and making sure that violence doesn't ensue, and she's not taken into custody. And that, I think, has to be backed up by external forces like the United States. So then we get to accountability and trying to get the old regime to see that this is the best of bad alternatives, right? If you touch any of these people on the street, the U.S. is coming in. And I would say, and it just, I rarely disagree with my brother Larry. I would say that it must be actually quite intimidating and humiliating to some degree to those who are running the Ministry of Defense and the security forces in Venezuela to have had Maduro plucked out from under them this way. I mean, the U.S. just demonstrated to all, including Iran, by the way, that they can do this. What stops them from doing it with other Venezuelan leaders should they lay a hand on the opposition as they mobilize society in the hope of either having, and I think this is something to decide that no one's touched on. What's the goal? Is the goal to have the electoral outcome of Gonzalez and Maria Corina instated, or is it to have new elections? That I mean, that's not clear to me. So I suppose that's a question to you. But this is what we want to get to. We want to get to rule of law. We want to get to the state. Okay, how do I move this forward? What happened to for some reason, this darn thing won't move forward. Let me get rid of this.
By the way, we can see your arrow. So.
Oh, you can see my arrow. Okay. But maybe that's what's holding me back from moving forward with I'll try moving to the next slide because it won't let me do that for some reason. And I can't get out of this, but let me stop sharing here and then see if I can get to the next slide. Okay, so the question then becomes, you can't see me right now, right?
Not yet.
You can't see the slides. Okay, so that's okay. There's several possible paths to democracy then, right? To get to this accountable government. From below with societal mobilization, so getting people out on the street, demanding representation. From above, which is elite-led, that could be initiated and managed, and this is what Larry was getting at, by autocratic or authoritarian elites. You need, soft liners basically to say, as Gorbachev did, Takjit Nalzia, we can't live this way anymore. I'm not going down with this ship, and I want to, transit to democracy. The other option is from beyond, and that is influence from abroad, either through the diffusion of ideas of a democratic regime type, influences of elites, foreign aid, training, and the like. Okay. There are lots of examples of transitions from below, the so-called colored revolutions, and the revolutions in 1989, Serbia in 2000, Georgia 2003. Ukraine is a really interesting comparative case, perhaps, for Venezuela, because I think it has a couple of lessons. So Ukraine in 2004, in the Orange Revolution, they were really good at challenging the electoral outcome, as you did in Venezuela. They had courts, however, that stood up for the winners, opposition winners of that election. The opposition stayed together through that process in 2004, and you get a democratically elected president in 2005 through a power sharing agreement, or basically a rewriting of parts of the Constitution. He's in power till 2010, and then the autocrat is reelected in 2010, toppled again in 2014, in exile, living in Russia. Russia's always a good option for people who want to live in Exile Putin likes to host them, apparently, but big difference in weather from Venezuela. Ukraine 2004, though, I think has some lessons of things not to do for Venezuela, which was one of the questions that Hector asked us to touch on. Although they managed to form a coalition of really hotly, well, almost openly hostile elites in the opposition to topple the autocratic regime in 2004, the coalition really falls apart between 2005 and 2010, when Viktor Yanukovych is elected legitimately, ultimately ousted in 2014. But I think one of the biggest obstacles in late transition is exactly this, is the opposition deciding, fine, we'll get together just to get rid of the old regime, but I want to be prime minister and you can't be. And they begin to undermine one another, and they don't actually produce change for the people who elected them. So I think that's very much a cautionary case for Venezuela. In terms of transition from above, that is a pacted transition. I think that's what I can kind of see a combination of scenarios for Venezuela. So one is you get people out onto the streets, you have US pressure and European pressure, and I don't know if it's possible for the Organization of American States pressure to say, don't lay a hand on those people. New elections are called, or recognition of the electoral results from a little over a year ago are recognized. And then you do what they did in Poland in 1989, 1990, and you have these roundtable talks between the authoritarian elite and between members of the regime. And they have to be conducted relatively quickly. And I think Jose is so right to emphasize the fact that there's a moment here of an opening that will disappear, and momentum will disappear. And Larry alluded to, as did Jose, we don't know exactly what Trump's point is. If it's stability, it doesn't seem to be democratization. But I think there's a real question about whether the regime can be stable if it's just left as is, and how much infighting is going on. But there's a big role here for the opposition, for the current regime, and for society to negotiate a pacted transition. And comparative studies and the data show, for the most part, this tends to be the most resilient form of democratic transition, where internal conflicts are sort of ironed out. They agree to give something up. Everyone is seen to be giving something up. And you may end up doing some of the things with the old regime that Jose mentioned, where only people who have committed human rights abuses, for example, are brought to justice or allowed to leave the country. And this is going to be a series of very difficult choices for any incoming Democrats. You have to lead these negotiations with not everyone being happy, but with a democratic system, and that is democracy, right? They are a combination of pressure from below and from above. It's interactive. And here are some examples of those. Another question is do you have lustration? There are great examples where that did happen, and great examples where it didn't happen. It's one of the big mistakes, I think, in Russia's transition, is that there was no lustration of communist elites. Even those who led a coup attempt against Gorbachev in 1991 within his own Politburo were not punished. That's a mistake. I think they have to either be allowed to exit the country with assets and a promise that, as soon as, if you try to destabilize the new regime, then, we're going to put you in jail if you try to come back here. That's very difficult. But negotiations are, the most stable form of transition. And again, just to get back to what I said at the outcome, they must believe that this is the best of otherwise bad alternatives for them. And so that's really the trick here, is getting the U.S. to assure Maria Corina and other members of the opposition that things are going to get really, really bad for you if that things will get very bad for the current regime, autocratic regime, if they touch you and if you lead protests, and that is probably a difficult thing to get from the Trump. Well, I don't want to say regime, but let's just say administration. Okay, so is a pact with external pressure for Venezuela a good possibility? And so I just put down here the example of the roundtable talks, which I talked about, and some of the issues that come up. But these are some of the kind of challenges of a pacted sort of transition. Oh, you can't see my slides, but I'll give them to you later. Who leads the negotiation with the opposition, if you can get to that point? Making sure that you include interests across different sectors of society. And really important lesson from other examples, keeping the opposition coalition together, keeping those egos necessarily in check and the interests in check to keep their eye on the ultimate prize, which is a democracy and a better future for Venezuela, and demonstrating that quickly to the Venezuelan people who've suffered so much in the last 2 decades in particular. So with that, I'll stop.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. Very, very, very insightful. We have many questions in the Q&A, so I'm gonna start distributing some of them. One of them is related to the framework that Rubio has outlined: stabilization, recovery, transition. They've expressed that it comes from a learning curve from similar interventions, operations in other contexts. And this question is really for you, Jose Ramon. In a time frame, it doesn't sound completely unreasonable, right? The plan described, and you've already expressed some of the constraints. But if we could put like a time frame here, if we could bring a time frame here, and the sequence of reforms that we need to be seeing in order for us to say, okay, we're locking in, we're front loading that democratic effort. How would it look like to you? What is the sequence of these reforms in a time frame?
Sorry, no, thank you so much, and excellent points raised. On the time frame, I think that this goes to a point that Larry was mentioning earlier, that is like the non-monolithic nature of the regime, and where are the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense, right? Like Padrino Lopez in Defense and Diosdado in Interior. So every account about the situation suggests that they were the ones that were not at all informed about events. No, it's uncertain whether Delcy knew, but apparently this has been talked about in Qatar for a long time, and I think that they were surprised by the fact that. So I think that the relationship is inherently unstable because they cannot feel certain when this happened without them knowing, and they know that they might be the ones that are, the next thing that Trump asks is the handling of them back to the US. So I think that you start to see signals of that instability. So for instance, a couple days ago, they released a few high-profile political prisoners. One of them was Juan Pablo Guanipa, who is like the second, I would say, from within Maria Corina's coalition, probably the second guy with most with the highest presence. And then he started to, go to the jail where other political prisons are, and started to like immediately like rattle the situation. And in an event at 11 p.m., some bands showed up. Some unidentified armed thugs took him in, and eventually later that night, the prosecutor's office came up with something like, no, we did this, right? My hunch is that was Diosdado moving independently to reassert the importance of him being part of every decision, right? Like the fact that the removal or the release of political prisoners means that he's losing relative weight, relative importance, because now he's not in control of that element of things. So I think that it's inherently unstable, but to the point of timing, usually like every list of things that need to happen soon usually has three things, right? Like release of political prisoners, um, the return of exiles, and then the decoupling of the repressive apparatus. In a way, I think that the time for things to become like kind of irreversibly democratic, it has to be the decoupling of the repressive apparatus, which does not has to do less with the military and has to do way more with the police forces, with the intelligence services, and more of the Diosdado side of things than the Padrino side of things. Something that is interesting is that while the military is guilty of acquiescence with everything that's happened, it's not the army that's been killing people on the streets, right? Like it's the police and the colectivos. So I would say that in terms of timeline, what needs to happen in the next few months, and it's gonna be conflictual, right? Like there's gonna be conflict because then the Russians also play, Diosdado also plays, is that you need to take him out, right? Like you the, he the, that and I think that he has incentives to move early against the accommodation as well. He has incentives to move because he needs to move before they do something to him. But I think that if you get to do away with that component, then other things can happen more organically because now there's no fear of going to the streets and demand the release of political prisoners, and now there's no fear of going of the exiles to come in and start organizing. So Leopoldo could show up, right? Like Borges could show up. The people that have left and could start to show up in Venezuela and start to organize the opposition for the other conditions to happen. But I think that what needs to happen, like in the next couple months, so that we can feel like certain that this is taking the right direction, is that decoupling of repressive apparatus. And to me, that means Diosdado going out. And I'm less certain about the role that Padrino and the Minister of Defense could play. But on the police side of things, I think it's the key thing that you need to see in the next couple of months. Or if not, I feel like now things are starting to yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think there is another question here talking about two objectives going forward for the Trump administration, which is control over the Venezuelan oil resource and the collapse of the government of Cuba. And I guess I think Larry would be well positioned to respond this one. What should we expect about Cuba now that they have restricted access to rents? Venezuela is not sending any more oil. Mexico wanted to jump in to give some support to the Cuban regime, but then Trump prevented Mexico from doing so sustainably. What could we expect in Cuba, Larry, and how that affects what's the U.S. strategy on Venezuela? What are your thoughts?
Well, before I answer that, I want to answer the first question, which is about a timeline and about the points that Jose Ramon just made. I think that the most important thing about a timeline is that it be specific and that there be credible commitments to it and guideposts that can be monitorable and enforceable and that have consequences for violation. Initially, my hope after the removal of Maduro is that there would be a rapid process for the installation of the legitimately elected government in July of 2024. Catherine raised this question of could that happen, I think is a realistic matter that's now off the table simply because the U.S. is not even close to insisting on it and history is just moving on. So that now, obviously, a key point in a timeline is going to be when are there going to be fresh elections? And, what will be the provisions for those elections? And I would say my view is that everything has to be off the table in terms of U.S. cooperation unless there are very intrusive provisions for international monitoring of the elections and for the defense of a new parallel vote tabulation, and inspection of the election machines and all of that. The credibility of that election is going to have to be, really heavily imagined and defended. And then the rest is simply mobilizing the same extraordinary network and technical operation that the opposition mounted for the July 2024 elections. I think, the other elements along the way include not only the release of political prisoners, but the non-accumulation of new political prisoners, including the rearrest of some of the preceding political prisoners. And there have to be, very serious consequences built in for new arrests, assassinations. They need to understand what the cost will be of that. And I would also put media on the table here. Will independent media now be allowed to operate and report again? And communicate. So there have to be, I think, very detailed provisions for political liberalization is the term we use, and authoritarian decompression along the way. I don't really like the word decoupling of the repressive apparatus. I assume you mean decoupling from the political regime. But, I think it doesn't signify enough of what needs to happen in terms of its depoliticization and reprofessionalization. And here, I think that needs its own separate timeline for steps that need to happen along the way. Here, I would highly recommend Al Stapon's book, Rethinking Military Politics. We're not talking about the military yet. We're talking about the police and intelligence, but the same sort of strategy, what he calls a politically led strategy for independence and ultimately democratic control needs to apply. Hector, to your question about Cuba, my answer is I don't know. But let me say that generations of democratic idealists like myself have wound up looking extremely foolish by assuming that just because Cuba or Zimbabwe or so many other North Korea, so many other authoritarian states I could name have slipped into, severe resource constraints, mass poverty, and widespread suffering, that is a formula for bringing down the regime. And obviously, these regimes get certain sources of persistence and defiance from resource flows, which they need to be cut off from. But immiseration is not in itself a strategy for regime change. It's just not. And so if we don't wed to the resource flows change a strategy for reviving and empowering opposition on the ground in Cuba, and again thinking about what would incentivize the regime to leave, we're nowhere. And without cracks in the Cuban regime, which may now be developing, but have not really publicly surfaced, I think we're a very long ways from a democratic transition there.
Thanks a lot, Larry. I think we have 1 or 2 minutes to go. I wanted to give Catherine a chance to lead us with some concluding remarks on what your reactions are, Catherine, to the challenges that we are facing. I think some people have been warning about a Russian-style transition, which leaves intact oligarchic networks, and then even if things go well, which I feel that most of the panel is questioning, even if things go well, if you leave those networks intact, they might stage a comeback, right, in the near future. But what are your final reactions, Catherine, to all of this?
So I don't actually think Russia's a good comparative case because they had so much economic reform to do, and so privatization is what created the sort of concentration of the economy and those oligarchs, and Putin has just replaced them with oligarchs more loyal to him. But I think that it's imperative that the Venezuelan opposition be able to rely on the Trump regime. And I think one of the questions I noticed in the chat is, what is Trump's goal? And I think we've seen that he doesn't really care about democracy and alliances as much as oil. And so how to get them to credibly and reliably commit to this very reasonable time frame that Larry has put forward to do these things, and how do we get the current regime to the negotiating table? Well, I think by somehow being able to guarantee that we will, cut special deals with oil with you. We will make the oil flow. We will make the country run better, and it will be more stable under us than it will be under them, because they're going to be, the autocrats are going to be infighting. They're unreliable. They hate each other. They're just stealing the wealth. And, as soon as you turn your back, they're going to try and return everything to us the way it was. But if you want reliability, if you want stability, if you want, deals on our natural resources, then the way to go is to have a transition to a liberal democracy that guarantees rights, freedoms, rule of law, as well as free and fair elections.
Dear Catherine, thanks a lot, and thanks to all of the panelists for a great conversation. So many questions untapped. I think we're gonna be probably addressing some of them in the rest of the series, and I use the opportunity to ask everybody in the audience to stay tuned to what the next webinars are gonna be. Some of them are gonna focus on economic stabilization and how they interact precisely with the political situation, both at the elite level and at the civil society level, and also how does security sector reform look in Venezuela, to make it compatible with a democratic transition. And we're finally going to end up with incentives, transitional justice, negotiations, how all these elements interact, and if there is room for them at the moment in the Venezuelan case. Again, everybody, thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for hosting this great conversation. And I hope we can stay connected and keep talking about these topics.